March 11, 1985. Moscow, the Kremlin. He is 44 years old when he walks into the Kremlin's top office, young by the fossilized standards of his predecessors, carrying a promise that sounds naive and thrilling at once. Open the windows, restructure the house, save the Union without breaking it. He does not look like Brezhnev or Chernenko, not in age, not in energy, not in the cadence of his words. From the beginning, Mikhail Gorbachev sells the idea that language itself, plain speech, debate, argument in public, can be an instrument of rescue. He calls it glasnost, openness, and he couples it with perestroika, restructuring, as if two levers, pulled together, could restart a stalled civilization. In the streets, people lean closer to television sets and radios because, for once, the slogans feel less like stone tablets and more like questions. In the West, anchors rehearse his name with careful syllables. Even his most sympathetic observers cannot tell whether he is a revolutionary dressed as a reformer or a reformer fated to unleash a revolution he cannot steer. The economic diagnosis is blunt. The Soviet machine, oversized and underperforming, throws steel and coal and tanks at the ledger, but cannot reliably put meat, soap, or decent shoes on store shelves. In the ministries, layers of command hide accountability. In the factories, targets are met on paper and missed in reality. In the countryside, harvests rot for lack of trucks and fuel at the right moment. Gorbachev believes that if people can finally say what is failing, they might help fix it. So newspapers test censors, television panels argue, banned books surface from the special collections, and historians begin naming the dead who, for decades, were listed as errors in a file or not listed at all. The country does not become free overnight. It becomes noisier, more honest, less afraid, and therefore angrier. For millions, anger feels like air after a long dive. For the apparat, anger feels like corrosion. Then the reactor explodes, not in Moscow, far away, in the Ukrainian SSR, in a town whose name most citizens have never heard, at a plant whose engineers are performing a late-night test that should have been routine. A pillar of invisible poison ascends into the night. In the first hours and days, a reflex older than him, secrecy, denial, euphemism, grips the system. May Day parades march under drifting dust. Foreign censors notice what domestic newspapers cannot say. Chernobyl becomes the test of his new language, and the verdict is not flattering. Openness collapses back into silence when it hurts most. Weeks later, when the scale of the catastrophe is impossible to hide, the reformer is forced to reform his own instincts about truth. Chernobyl does not create glasnost, but it burns away any pretense that the old methods can coexist with it. The state learns that silence is not protection, it is accelerant. He learns it too, and the learning will scar him. Abroad, he is a sensation because he offers something the Cold War has not permitted for decades, a credible partner who seems genuinely interested in ending the ritual of terror by timetable. He talks to Ronald Reagan not as a prop in a photograph, but as a rival he might persuade. In Reykjavík, in a small house rattled by North Atlantic wind, they explore ideas that sound beyond audacious. What if the unimaginable could be imagined with paper and ink? What if entire categories of nuclear weapons could be scrapped, inspected, verified, hauled out of silos, and sent to death like livestock? For 2 days, the conversation rises and falls and rises again. Misunderstandings of language and strategy collide with a single immovable object in the room: Reagan's dream of missile defense, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and Gorbachev's refusal to let it live on in space while the Earth disarms. They do not sign history in Iceland, but everyone who studies arms control will tell you that history is written there anyway, because both men leave with the map of a future treaty in their pockets, and the world realizes that the nuclear age has acquired a zipper. A year later, the zipper moves. In Washington, under bright winter light, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is signed. Whole families of missiles, the Pershings and SS-20s that had haunted Europe's skies and parks and protest posters, are condemned to dismantlement with a set of verification procedures that would have been unthinkable when Brezhnev was alive. Inspectors will visit, measure, count, and check again. Cameras will stare at doors. Seals will break in their presence. The theater of fear becomes the theater of inspection, and the audience, at least for a moment, breathes out. For this achievement and for the easing of a 40-year siege in Europe, the Nobel Committee will later call his name. At home, he will be mocked as the darling of Western prize committees and magazine covers. Abroad, he will be remembered as the man who made a signature symbolize less. The paradox is already visible in the applause. While diplomats invent new verbs for disarmament, soldiers pack crates at the edge of an old war. Afghanistan has become a wound the superpower can no longer ignore. It was supposed to be a police action against history. It became an education in geography, in blood, and in the limits of ideology to feed a garrison. In 1988, columns roll toward the Friendship Bridge, and by February 1989, the last commander steps onto Soviet soil to declare, with a veteran's mixture of pride and weariness, that the international duty is complete. Veterans return to gray apartments with injuries that do not fit on paper, and the country notices how quiet their homecoming is. The withdrawal is advertised as a new realism. It is also, in the public mind, an admission that the Union can no longer afford illusions abroad when shortages at home are, literally, on the shelves. At street level, the reforms taste different from the slogans. If you are a journalist, you can write what you once whispered, and you pay for it with threats from those who preferred whispers. If you direct a factory, you are told to be efficient and entrepreneurial, but prices are still fixed and supplies still rationed, and the plan survives as a ghost in every accounting book. If you are a shopper, you line up before dawn because rumors say that a truck might come today. If you are a party boss in a republic along the periphery, you watch as citizens sing in public squares and wave flags that were supposed to stay in museums. In the Baltics, a human chain stretches from capital to capital on the 50th anniversary of a pact that once erased their countries with a signature. The chain is a sentence written on the land, and everyone can read it, even those who pretend they cannot. The pressure is not only cultural or national, it is mechanical. In a command economy, information flows slowly upward and downward like thick oil. Glasnost thins the oil, which is good for truth and bad for those whose authority relied on sediment. Perestroika attempts to bolt market incentives onto ministries designed to ignore them. The result is a machine that alternates between choking and spinning. Managers are told to produce for profit, then punished for disobeying orders that no longer make sense. Shop directors hoard goods to survive tomorrow because tomorrow's rules change every week. Economists, even those who want the reforms to work, explain in journals that the industrial structure is obsolete and the service sector immature. Households feel this as empty cabinets and rumors of higher prices. Gorbachev tells people to wait for harvest after sowing. They ask how to eat until then. He is, in the West, a celebrity reformer, a man photographed with rock stars and presidents and adoring crowds. He is, at home, the face of the queue. In some republics, he is the cautious voice who refuses to send tanks. In others, he is the commander who sends soldiers into city squares to reassert order after rage turns to riot. This is the contradiction that begins to define him, the peacemaker abroad who speaks the language of force when borders inside the country begin to look like front lines. His supporters defend the impossible balance he is trying to achieve. His enemies exploit the inevitable disappointments that balance produces. In a system where legitimacy used to mean silence, new legitimacy now requires explaining every wound. He can explain only some and only some of the time. In the spring and summer of 1991, whispers thicken into forecasts. The Union is drafting a new treaty, one that promises more autonomy to the republics while preserving a federal frame. Conservatives in the party and the security organs see the document as a funeral announcement folded into law. They convince themselves that extraordinary measures must rescue ordinary life. In August, while the leader vacations in Crimea, a committee of men, some familiar to television viewers, some not, appears on the screen to declare emergency. The word stinks of the 1930s and of 1968. It also smells immediately of failure. Tanks grind into Moscow, and citizens climb them with cigarettes and flowers. In another capital, a man stands on a tank turret with a piece of paper and a voice that sounds like the end of an era. The coup collapses in 3 days, defeated by incompetence and by crowds who have learned, under glasnost, to act as if they own their city. The plotters are arrested, and the rescue operation rescues nothing at all. Yet the Union that survives those 3 days is not the Union that existed the week before. Something more than a coup has died. The myth that the center can still command history has been buried with it. He returns to Moscow diminished by other people's failure. He has not organized the coup, but it will organize the rest of his life. Men who once saluted him now walk past him to negotiate their own destinies. The Russian Federation, with Boris Yeltsin at its pulpit and a new vocabulary of sovereignty on its tongue, claims the microphone and does not give it back. The President of the Union still holds the office. The country he presides over is vanishing as he speaks. Ministries rename themselves. Flags do not wait for laws. Every day is a seminar in constitutional improvisation, and even the most experienced lawyers cannot keep up with the speed at which decades of doctrine dissolve into air. A remarkable feature of this unmaking is its theatrical calm. At the end, there will be no barricades in Moscow, no last artillery rattling the windows of the Kremlin. There will be a desk, a camera, a man with a grave, deliberate voice, and a sentence that sounds like a eulogy written by the deceased. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sits before the nation and says that he is ceasing his activity as President of the USSR. It is the meekest possible verb for the loudest possible event. In the courtyard, the flag with hammer and sickle slides down the pole for the final time, and a tricolor rises in its place. He does not present himself as a martyr. He does not beg. He catalogues achievements and acknowledges failures and leaves the room like a civil servant after a long shift. The world recognizes the dignity. His detractors recognize the vacancy. The Union is no longer a map. It is a memory contest. And then there is the strange second life of a man who used to own the first. In the late 1990s and 2000s, he appears in lecture halls and on charity rostrums and in the offices of independent editors who still believe that newspapers can matter in a country that has stopped pretending they don't. He runs for president once and learns his real vote share. He invests in a paper that will become a martyr factory for courage. He is eulogized in the West while lampooned at home, the foreigner's Russian and the Russian who, to his enemies, spoke foreign. He lives long enough to see the treaties he signed treated like brittle paper, and the vocabulary he introduced treated like a threat. He dies at 91, and the obituaries must decide whether he broke the world in order to fix it or fix the world by giving up the power to break it. Both choices feel like synonyms. But the center of his story is not outside him. It is a contested conviction running through every decision that systems can be saved by telling the truth about them. He did not practice pure democracy, and he did not wish to. He wanted to democratize a one-party state without surrendering the prerogatives that defined it. He wanted citizens to speak, to appoint. He wanted the press to expose, to a degree. He wanted republics to elect, to remain. The tension between desire and limit is not a defect of his philosophy. It is his philosophy. It is also why the reforms constantly felt like driving a car whose transmission swapped gears without warning. Freedom arrived like a tide to a city without seawalls. The builders blamed the tide, the swimmers thanked it. The mayor tried to legislate the ocean. It is tempting, in hindsight, to make him either a saint of peace or the architect of collapse. Both poses ignore the mechanics of 1980s power. Arms control was not a favor, it was a bargain born of need and opportunity. The Soviet economy could not afford the tempo of military innovation demanded by the 1970s and early 1980s without starving consumer life and political patience. The INF Treaty, therefore, was not a gift to Reagan. It was a reprieve for a system that needed oxygen. Conversely, the ending of censorship was not a sudden conversion to liberalism. It was an attempt to harvest information from below because the top had run out of ideas. In that sense, his boldest deeds abroad and his most controversial experiments at home are the same deed, an admission that the logic of secrecy had run out. If you listen to the tapes and transcripts from Reykjavík, you hear not a magician, but a man arguing, sometimes clumsily, sometimes brilliantly, about trade-offs. You hear impatience with choreography. You hear, above all, an intuition that theater itself had trapped both superpowers in rituals that no longer protected them. Reagan, whose rhetoric terrified many of his critics, turns out to be the partner Gorbachev needs to break the liturgy. They fail together in Iceland in order to succeed in Washington. It is one of the oddities of the Cold War's ending that ideology steps aside to let personalities draft the finale. This is not to reduce institutions. It is to acknowledge that institutions sometimes require two people to say, "What if?" long enough for the room to consider it genuine. And yet, for all the power of personality, there are the national questions that cannot be settled by summitry. In the Baltics, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, even in parts of Russia itself, identities suppressed by decades of state grammar resume speaking their native grammar. Glasnost, in these places, is less about criticizing a factory director and more about recovering a flag, a church, a cemetery, a border. When the center loosens, the edges move. Gorbachev hopes to bind them with a new treaty. Many of them prefer paper of another kind, declarations of independence. The singing revolution, the human chain, the ballots that test the patience of the presidium, these are not side plots. They are the lesson that empire ends quietly until it doesn't. The more he negotiates autonomy within, the more leaders beyond Moscow negotiate sovereignty without. He tries to be a federalist in a house that remembers empire. The memory wins. Consider the image many Russians keep as shorthand for the late 1980s, the store with empty shelves and a queue that curves around the block in winter. For them, reform means standing longer for less. Consider the image many Europeans keep, a pen hovering over a treaty that bans the weapons they dreaded as children. For them, reform means sleeping easier. Consider the image many Americans keep, the handshake with a rival they were taught to despise. For them, reform means a story about winning without war. Consider the image many Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, and Balts keep, the moment when police pulled back and a crowd discovered its lungs. For them, reform means a chance to become a country again. That one man can sit at the center of these four lenses and be judged simultaneously as failure, savior, partner, and accidental midwife is not a contradiction to resolve. It is the shape of his legacy. The tragedy that the title of this story promises is not a melodrama of individual ruin. It is the tragedy of an engineer who discovers that the blueprint he inherited is printed on dissolving paper. He labors to copy it onto new stock, redrawing the rooms while people still live in them, insisting that plumbing and electricity will continue during the renovation. Halfway through, water pours down the staircase, an electrical fire licks the wallpaper, and neighbors shout through the dust that they cannot breathe. He refuses to condemn the house. They move their furniture into the street. He goes outside to reason with them and finds that the street has become a city council. He is, in every sense, outvoted. Perhaps the fairest rephrasing is this: he was a reformer who believed the Soviet system contained within it the capacity to be decent. When it did not, he was judged by the speed at which he admitted the fact. Abroad, he admitted it quickly in the form of arms control and withdrawal from an unwinnable war. At home, he admitted it slowly, because to admit it entirely would be to abolish the office he occupied, and he was still its custodian. When the office vanished, he accepted the verdict with a sentence no other leader of that country would have spoken without coercion. He did not call in the tanks to overturn the votes. He folded the flag and left the room. This is also part of the true story. After he is gone, debates over his culpability and his courage will continue like an argument in a kitchen after the dinner ends. Some will insist that the empire would have dissolved no matter who sat in the chair, that demography, technology, and bankruptcy had already co-authored the script. Some will insist that a tougher manager, more batons in Vilnius, more sensors in Moscow, more tanks everywhere, could have preserved the architecture for another decade at least, and perhaps delivered it to a successor who would have modernized without mercy. Some will say that his signal achievement was to end the Cold War without a world war, that the checkmark by that line item is worth the price. Some will say that the price was paid by people who never asked for a bargain. These conversations are not footnotes. They are how countries metabolize endings. When you listen to his resignation speech today, the prose is almost bureaucratic in its modesty, and yet a different sound rustles in the margins, like paper being turned in a long book. He thanks, he notes, he refrains. He does not instruct the future in how to remember him. He lets the act of leaving define him more than any sentence he could craft. The flag change that follows is theater, but also relief, fury, grief, and anticipation compacted into a single motion of rope through a pulley. Millions will remember exactly where they were when the red rectangle came down and the tricolor went up, not because they loved either cloth, but because the act told them, finally, that their biographies would no longer be written as chapters in a single book called The Soviet Union, that the book would live in libraries and on shelves and in memory, but not in law, that they would write their own sequels. And so, if this story is tragic, it is because it ends with a man standing beside an absence he helped reveal. He meant to refit a ship at sea. He discovered that the hull was a collection of boats tied together, some of which had already started rowing in different directions. He tried to lengthen the rope. The knots loosened anyway. He unclenched his fist and watched his own crew step onto other decks. He saluted them and hoped the ocean would be kind. History, which rarely offers kindness to those who lose, has given him something more complicated, a world that sleeps more easily because of him, and a nation that wakes each morning asking whether he stole its dreams or spared it nightmares. He is not, in the end, an answer to the question of whether systems change from above or below. He is a reminder that the direction of change is a matter of timing. When the ground softens, the foundation shifts whether or not the architect approves. He taught a society to speak and then could not select its vocabulary. He shrank arsenals abroad and could not shrink shortages at home. He made it permissible to ask why, and then found himself the subject of that question. He touched the first domino with a finger labeled openness, and the last one fell in places he never intended to visit. The record shows applause and curses. The lived experience shows marriages, divorces, bankruptcies, first elections, full churches, closed factories, and new passports. The single life at the center of all that cannot be anything but tragic, even if you believe it was also necessary. If you are looking for villains or saints, you can find them in his orbit. the hardliners who feared a looser union more than they feared failure, the opportunists who converted the twilight of empire into dawn for themselves, the hawks and the doves abroad who used his name as evidence for whatever they already believed about strength and weakness. If you are looking for a man who tried to keep promises to incompatible audiences, citizens who wanted goods and dignity quickly, generals who wanted certainty, allies who wanted assurance, rivals who wanted proof, then you have found him. If you are looking for a clean ending, you will not find it here. He leaves the scene having accomplished things that will survive him and having failed at the thing he most wanted to survive him. That is the texture of the story, not a verdict, but a fabric. There is a simple way to test the magnitude of his life. Imagine the late 20th century without the treaty he signed in Washington, without the near deal at Reykjavík that made the Washington deal possible. Imagine Europe's parks still shadowed by launchers that no longer exist. Imagine a Soviet army still trying to pacify a country it could not understand. Imagine a party that never heard its own citizens insult it on state television. Imagine a December with no speech, because there was no office called President of the USSR, and therefore no one to resign from it. The alternative timeline does not guarantee catastrophe, but it keeps the grenade pins closer to the floor. If you believe that fewer grenades on the floor is not trivial, then you already know why. Despite everything, some people cannot say his name without softening. What remains after the speeches and the statues and the insults is a lesson that many countries will relearn in different accents. That truth, once invited in, rearranges the furniture. He invited it because secrecy had stopped working. He hoped to seat it at the table as a guest. It took a chair at the head, and then it knocked down a wall to open the room to a courtyard full of people who had been waiting for years to look inside. Some call this the mistake that ruined a great experiment. Others call it the cure that broke a fever and left the patient weak but alive. The point, for our purposes, is that the act was deliberate and the consequence was unpredictable until it was inevitable. He will never be universally loved, and that may be healthy. A country that can argue about him without fear is closer to the promise he tried to hold in his hands. The West will continue to remember him with the warm grammar of helped end the Cold War. Those who endured the shocks of the 1990s will continue to remember him with colder grammar, connecting his name to empty shelves and wages that shrank faster than hopes grew. The truth of his life is the coexistence of those sentences. The tragic true story of Mikhail Gorbachev is not that he failed to choose between them. It is that he built the page that allowed both to be written at once. If you want to find him, you can go to the footage where he laughs easily with strangers in foreign capitals, or to the footage where his mouth is a straight line, while men in suits announce an emergency that cannot survive 3 days of daylight. You can go to the transcripts where he and an American president circle around the phrase, "abolish nuclear weapons," like two men daring each other to say, "forever," and then return home to staffs who explain why forever is too long for policy. You can go to the bridge where armored columns turned around because history's slope was downward and the cost of climbing had finally exceeded pride. You can go to the desk where he placed a nation on the table like an object and then stepped away. In each of those places, you will hear the same sentence, whether spoken by diplomats, veterans, shoppers, or singers. We could not go on as we had, and he was the first to admit it in a way that required the rest of us to live with the admission. This is his story, told without miracle, offered without alibi. A man born into a state that promised eternity becomes the agent of its end by trying to give it another beginning. He teaches a language that reveals what the old language hid. He bargains away the weapons that made his country formidable because he knows that formidability cannot be eaten. He invites citizens to stand upright and discovers that upright citizens sometimes walk away. He accepts the consequence in public. He dies many years later in a different Russia, while his name persists as a synonym for what might have been better and for what was made worse. Between those bookends lies the weight of history that cannot fit into any single verdict, only into a long, complicated paragraph like this one, where praise and blame sit at the same table and do not finish their argument before the credits roll. Spring 1985, Moscow and the provinces. The first reform that most citizens can taste is not a law about enterprise or a debate on television. It is the bottle that suddenly vanishes from the kiosk and the wedding table. Vines are uprooted, shops stripped of vodka, hours curtailed by decree. It is called a struggle with drunkenness and alcoholism. And in the ledger, it produces a clean, immediate number. Official spirits production plunges, mortality tied to alcohol falls. The Treasury bleeds revenue as moonshine bubbles in kitchens that had never owned copper coils before. The campaign says something the rest of the system has not yet learned to say, cause and effect. But it also teaches the country a different lesson about reform. When the state closes one door overnight, people build another by morning. Summer 1985 to 1986, ministries and shop floors. The word perestroika translates badly into daily life until it is attached to a statute. Then it acquires weight. The law on state enterprise arrives with an ambitious promise to push decision-making down into factories, to let managers set output beyond plan orders, to make prices and profit mean something inside a system that had treated them as ritual rather than signal. On paper, the law is radical. In practice, it is a hinge that creaks. Managers are told to act like entrepreneurs while still filling mandatory orders. They are responsible for performance, but not free to own the tools that determine it. Where the law loosens, hoarding begins. Where it tightens, initiative stalls. The contradiction is not a footnote. It is the point at which the old machine begins to grind, then lurch. May 1988, the law on cooperatives. If the state enterprise statute tries to liberalize a command system from within, the cooperative law saws a hole in the wall. For the first time since the new economic policy era, worker-owned cooperatives in services and small manufacturing are legal. Cafes and repair shops open with new fonts on their signs. Import kiosks appear where paperwork used to live. Taxes are harsh at first, then eased, when even the taxmen realize strangling the infant defeats the point. The policy creates a new class, perestroika millionaires, who offend egalitarian sensibilities and prove that scarcity was not only a matter of ideology, but also of permission. For a state trained to equate private profit with private crime, the sight of legal cash stacked in tills is a shock. February-March 1988, Nagorno-Karabakh, and then Sumgait. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, a local petition over borders erupts into demonstrations, counter-demonstrations, and then into something older and uglier, a pogrom. In the industrial city of Sumgait, Armenians are targeted, apartments burned, lives ruined and ended. Moscow condemns, arrests, promises order. But the country has seen the footage, heard the names of the dead, and learned two things at once: that national questions the center suppressed have survived to demand language, and that glasnost is not a seminar. It is a pressure valve that cannot be resealed without shrapnel. April 9, 1989, Tbilisi. Nightsticks and sharpened spades, tear gas and panic in the square. By morning, 21 people are dead. The funerals fill streets. The images fill screens beyond Georgia. The crack of that night resounds past the Caucasus. When the center uses force, it now does so on camera, and the camera belongs to the country as much as to the party. The lesson for the periphery is not clarity but calculation. How much daylight can a protest survive? How much dusk can a crackdown endure? Summer-autumn 1989, the edges of the block. A Hungarian wire is cut along the Austrian border. A picnic turns into an exodus. East German cars line Austrian towns with washing machines strapped to roofs, as if conspicuous consumption could be an amulet. The point is not consumerism, it is permission. Moscow does not send tanks. A month later, the Polish experiment yields a government led by non-communists. By November, a garbled press conference in East Berlin opens a wall that had taught Europe to flinch. A Soviet spokesman replies to questions about doctrine with a joke about Frank Sinatra. Every country can do it my way. The joke is a doctrine. The doctrine is a signal to crowds that were already moving. The signal becomes a landslide, named 1989. December 2nd to 3rd, 1989, off Malta, aboard ships in a storm. George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev meet and declare an end to the Cold War, not by treaty text, not with an orchestra in a palace, but with sentences that announce a shared conclusion already obvious from Warsaw to Berlin. The age of automatic confrontation is over. The seas are rough, the images are awkward, the words matter. A world that had breathed in fear for 40 years begins to exhale carefully. 1990, German reunification talks. The 2+4 process turns what could have been a catastrophe of speed into a controlled descent. The 2 German states plus the 4 occupying powers agree on sovereignty, borders, and the shape of post-war leftovers. Gorbachev, who had promised freedom of choice to allies, now has to live with the consequences. A united Germany inside NATO, unthinkable a few years earlier, becomes thinkable under assurances and new relationships that he accepts. The settlement closes the file that opened at Potsdam. The map shrugs off a scar. October-December 1990, Oslo and Moscow. The Nobel Committee calls his name. He does not travel for the ceremony. The acceptance is read on his behalf. When he gives his lecture the following year, he speaks in a grammar learned in icy rooms, about interdependence, about a world too fragile for the old parade of blocks and battalions. At home, the medal is an irritant coated in pride, foreign applause while bread coupons thicken. The paradox grows teeth. Summer-autumn 1990, the economy falters. The most radical proposal yet arrives with a timer on its cover, 500 days. Shock therapy, price freedom, privatization, decentralization, a new competitive economy grafted at speed onto an exhausted trunk. Yeltsin embraces it. Gorbachev hesitates, then retreats under fire from ministers and industrial chiefs who see not therapy but amputation. The plan withers, the shortages do not. The center's legitimacy, already fragile, wears thinner each week that citizens carry ration books like identity papers. January 1991, Vilnius. Crowds make a wall of bodies around a television tower and a press house. Tanks push, soldiers fire, 14 civilians die before dawn. It is the bloodiest domestic repression since Tbilisi, and it happens in a republic that insists it has already recovered its independence. The world watches. The Kremlin issues statements that try to be both legalistic and humane. The footage defeats the adjectives. The price of holding the Union together grows visible in faces and funerals. Between these public convulsions, there are the quieter reversals that tell the story of the state's stamina. The budget depends on oil. At the exact moment oil volumes dip and prices refuse to obey the plan. Trade rules are rewritten while trucks cannot find diesel. Household incomes surge on paper while the shops sell paper. What statistics do not capture, line length does. The Great Contraction begins before anyone dares to call it that. And then August. A committee on television, a leader isolated in Crimea, columns in Moscow that cannot remember how to frighten, a man on a tank reading not from a teleprompter, but from a future. The coup's failure does not rescue the old center. It exposes how little is left of it. Within weeks, party property is seized, the KGB is split, and republics accelerate toward legal exit. Gorbachev returns to an office whose walls are still there and whose meaning is gone. The Union Treaty he had negotiated, compromise layered on compromise, is dead without a vote. The stage belongs to those who promise sovereignty first, solutions later. In the background of the headlines is a figure whose release had once symbolized the new vocabulary, Andrei Sakharov. His return from internal exile by phone call in December 1986, his presence in a televised Congress where he criticized the system to its face, had taught citizens how rapidly the unthinkable can become the ordinary. His death in 1989 was a private loss and a public metaphor. Glasnost had restored a conscience. Now it had to build a country. The gap between those tasks turned out to be the length of the 1990s. By late 1991, the arithmetic of politics has simplified. Either a new union is signed by republics as equals, or there will be no union to sign. Negotiations in forest retreats and government offices produce drafts, then silence, then different drafts with different names. While lawyers argue paragraphs, the street discovers that the tricolor suits television better than the red banner. The end arrives in December not with a siege but with signatures in a Belarusian hunting lodge, and then, days later, a televised resignation in Moscow. If the Cold War needed Malta to announce its end, the Soviet Union needs only a camera and a rope on a flagpole. What survives the dates is the texture of change. The anti-alcohol campaign showed that the state could move quickly and that society would move around it faster. The enterprise and cooperative laws proved that ownership and responsibility cannot be assigned in opposite directions without friction turning into fire. The national movements taught the center that history is not a file, but a pulse. The tragedies in Sumgait, Tbilisi, and Vilnius taught citizens that the price of delay would be paid in names read at funerals. The Sinatra Doctrine showed the world that Moscow would no longer spend blood to secure obedience, and that obedience, once optional, disappears. Malta and 2+4 demonstrated that a superpower can step back from the brink by sentences rather than salvos. The Nobel medal reflected a safer planet and a hungrier country, shining warmly in the cold of a failing winter. And beneath the outcomes, the man. The same voice that told an exile to come home told allies they could choose another future, and told citizens at the end that he would cease his activity rather than order a last performance of force. The biography fits no single verdict because it measures against two yardsticks at once: fewer missiles in the air, less bread in the shops. If you need only one, choose your favorite. If you need both, you have to live with contradiction as a historical fact rather than a rhetorical flaw. That is what the late 1980s and early 1990s offered the world. Relief and rupture braided so tightly that even now the strands cannot be separated without breaking. The second part of his story, then, is not an appendix to collapse, but a record of choices in a house already leaning. He pried open windows. The wind knocked down frames he had hoped to mend. He loosened the leash abroad, the pack scattered at home. He replaced the grammar of threat with the grammar of inspection. The camera that recorded missile cuts also recorded cues and crackdowns. He proved that a nuclear age could acquire a zipper. He learned that an empire, once unzipped, does not close again without tearing the cloth. And if, years later, the world still argues about what he could have done differently, that argument is proof that his method, language first, force last, worked at least well enough to leave us a world where argument, not artillery, supplies the punctuation. He did not end hunger. He ended a war without a battle. He did not preserve a union. He preserved the possibility that unions can be dissolved without a funeral of nations. He did not reconcile every border. He taught borders to change on maps more often than on fields. Those are not small things. They are the reasons his name still appears in headlines when treaties are tested and when crowds begin to sing. December 8, 1991. Vyskuly, Belovej Forest, Belarus. 3 leaders sign papers at a hunting lodge, the ink colder than the snow outside. Russia's Boris Yeltsin, Ukraine's Leonid Kravchuk, Belarus's Stanislav Shushkevich. Their signatures sit beneath a sentence no one in Moscow ever expected to read on official stationery, that the Union has effectively ceased to exist, and that, in its place, there shall be a commonwealth of independent states. The document is spare, almost bureaucratic in tone, but it does the loudest thing a document can do. It names an ending. In rooms 1,000 kilometers away, men who memorize the preamble of the 1977 Constitution stare at the television as if it were speaking a foreign language. The lamplight falls on a map that has just been relabeled without moving a border stone. December 9th to 12th, 1991. Moscow. Telephones throb in ministries that had defined themselves by permanence. What does this mean for treaties? What does this mean for troops? What does this mean for fuel? Each question is both legal and mechanical. Which seal is valid? Which payroll still exists? Which chain of command is no longer a chain? The General Secretary, who is also the President of the Union, does not resign. Instead, he rehearses a line about preserving a union in treaty form as equals if the republics will have it. They will not. For them, Beloveja is not a rough draft. It is a decision. December 21st, 1991. Alma-Ata, Almaty, Kazakhstan. 11 republics crowd a stage and make the decision in public. The Alma-Ata Protocol folds Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan into the original triad, with Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus at the center, and declares not only the creation of the Commonwealth, but a position that ends the legal suspense. The USSR will be recognized as having ceased to exist as a subject of international law. Alongside the signatures, the assembled leaders confirm Marshal Yevgeny Shaposhnikov as acting commander-in-chief of the CIS armed forces and draft measures for nuclear weapons, because the arithmetic of sovereignty has to share the table with the arithmetic of warheads. The camera pans across a row of flags that have become statements, not decorations. December 25, 1991. Moscow, Kremlin. A desk, a camera, and the sentence that ends an age. As a result of the newly formed situation, creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, I cease my activities in the post of the USSR President. The delivery is measured, almost prosaic. He speaks of sovereignty, of the new, of the unity that could not be preserved in the old form, of reforms that open the archive of truth and the street to politics. There is no plea, no threat, only the grammar of finality. The broadcast finishes. Outside, the red flag with hammer and sickle slides down the Kremlin pole. The white-blue-red tricolor climbs into the winter air. A nation that promised eternity yields to a state that promises itself it will learn to be ordinary. The rope stops moving, and with it, one of the 20th century's longest sentences. December 26, 1991. Moscow. The Soviet of the Republics gathers for the last time and reads itself out of existence. Declaration number 142. N terminates the Union as a subject of international law and as a political reality. What had been de facto is now de jure. There is no artillery, only microphones and a vote. The building that taught generations to fear procedure becomes the place where procedure buries the thing that built the building. The chambers are quiet when the members file out. No one lingers to memorize the carpet. By nightfall, the bureaucratic verbs, dissolved, terminated, transferred, have completed what armies once began. December 27th to 31st, 1991. From Moscow to the Republic capitals, letterheads change faster than furniture. Diplomatic missions swap plaques. Commanders at remote bases receive signals that confirm what they already suspected from the television. Orders now originate from new capitals bearing familiar names. Where state farms once sent harvest reports, local governments send faxes about borders, customs, currency. On New Year's Eve, there is nothing for a camera to film except fireworks and the quiet recalculation of millions of private lives. The maps on schoolroom walls will be replaced in the spring. The atlases in people's heads begin the slower work of editing themselves tonight. January 1st to 3rd, 1992. Moscow. The Soviet Union does not wake up. The Russian Federation does. Decrees that could only be speculative under one flag become enforceable under another. The sentences from the resignation speech, the ones about the necessity of change, about sovereignty that is not barricaded by tanks, echo without the voice that first gave them official permission. A superpower has ended without a shot fired in its capital. The ledger of what that prevented and what that permitted will be argued for decades in kitchens and in parliaments. For the moment, the undisputed facts fit on a single page of dates, proper nouns, and signatures. Partisans on every side will say the page omits what matters. The page is what governments are made of.